The Ewaso Nyiro runs brown after rain. Not brown like mud, brown like old wood, like something the earth has been holding for a long time and finally let go all at once. By morning, it had risen past the acacia roots on the southern bank, curling wide and fast around the bend near Larson's, where the elephants have always crossed. The Virtues crossed that morning. They had done it before, the oldest females reading the water first, the young ones following close. The whole group pressing through the current in a slow, deliberate mass that trusted its own weight. They reached the other side. Somewhere in the noise of the crossing, the rushing water, the churned silt, the low rumbles of reassurance moving between adults. A 2-month-old calf did not make it with them. He was on the wrong side. Not swept far, not injured, not calling loudly yet. Just on the wrong side of a river that was still rising. The Virtues moved on. Not because they abandoned him, but because in the chaos of moving water and sound, the signal that should have stopped them never arrived. He stood at the edge of the bank. He waited. He did not yet understand what waiting alone meant. The grass on the bank of the Ewaso Nyiro is the color of old straw in the dry season. But that morning it held water in its blades. Each stem bent slightly under the weight of it, the whole bank glittering faintly in the early light in a way that would have been beautiful under any other circumstance. He stood in that grass and was almost invisible. A 2-month-old African elephant is small enough to be hidden entirely by a stand of dry grass, and from a distance he could have been a stone, a shadow, a piece of driftwood left by the retreating floodwater. He was none of those things. He was alive and alone and doing what every young calf does when the world stops making sense. He stayed still and he called out and he waited for an answer that did not come. His trunk swayed as he called, not with the controlled precision of an adult elephant reading the air, but loosely, uncertainly, the way a trunk moves at 2 months of age when the thousands of muscles inside it have not yet learned to work together, when the brain has not yet mapped the instrument it has been given. The dark hair on his forehead and along his spine, still thick at this age, lay flat against his skin in the damp air left by the rain. The call of a 2-month-old elephant is not the sound most people imagine when they think of elephants. It is not a trumpet. It is closer to a high, thin keen, the kind of sound that travels short distances, designed for a mother within reach, not for a family already moving away on the other side of a swollen river. He called several times. The river answered instead, indifferent and constant, filling every pause with the sound of itself. He took a few steps toward the water, then stopped at the edge where the bank dropped away into the current. He turned back. He found the patch of ground where he had been standing and returned to it, not randomly, but with the purposefulness of a very young animal, following the only instruction instinct had given him so far: stay where you were last seen. On the far side of the Ewaso Nyiro, the Virtues were already moving. The matriarch set the pace as she always did, unhurried, reading the ground ahead through the soles of her feet, the way elephants read terrain, sensing vibration, moisture, the faint chemical trails left by other herds that had passed through before the rain. The other females fell in around her, and the young calves pressed close to their mother's legs, half hidden in the forest of gray limbs, finding the shelter that only proximity to something large and warm and known can provide. There was no alarm in the group. No searching behavior, no pausing and turning back, no matriarch lifting her trunk to test the air behind them. The river had done its work too efficiently. The noise of the crossing had covered the sound of one small voice on the wrong bank. And now the distance was doing the rest, the gap between them widening with every step the family took north. They were not abandoning him. They simply did not know. Back on his side of the river, he had been alone for some time now. The African savanna, in the hours after rain, carries a particular stillness, the birds that had sheltered through the downpour, resuming their sounds in careful layers. The liquid call of a robin chat somewhere in the acacia scrub, the dry ticking of a hornbill overhead, the background hiss of grass, releasing moisture into air that was already beginning to warm toward the heat the day would become. He stood in the middle of it all, still and separate. He called again. The sun climbed. He had stopped calling as frequently now, the intervals between each sound growing longer. the sound itself flattening, losing the sharp edge of urgency and becoming something lower and more spent. He lay down in the grass. Not in the loose, easy way a calf lies down when it is comfortable and milk-full and warm against its mother's flank, but in the slow, uncertain way of a body that is beginning to run low on whatever it is that keeps young things upright and trying. The ground beneath him was still cool from the night. He pressed his chin against it and stayed there, and the grass rose around him on all sides, and from even a short distance away, he was nearly impossible to see. A safari vehicle had come to a stop on the track above the bank some time before its engine cut the two people inside very still. They had seen something they could not immediately explain. A small elephant. No herd anywhere. No adults in any direction. They did not get out of the vehicle. They understood the way people who have spent time in this landscape sometimes do, that the right response to what they were seeing was not action, but restraint, that getting out would be wrong, that moving closer would be wrong, that the correct thing was smaller and quieter, and involved a phone pressed to a window while they watched the grass below the track for movement. The call they made set something else in motion entirely. Somewhere north of the river, a different kind of attention had already been moving toward the place where the calf had been left. The team from Save the Elephants knows the virtues, not in the way that tourists come to know a famous herd. The landmark animals, the matriarch with the notched ear, the adolescent males who approach vehicles out of curiosity, but in the deeper, slower way that comes from years of following the same families across the same ground, watching them born and watching them age, learning the individual rhythms of each animal until the herd becomes less like a group you observe and more like a place you know well enough to notice when something is wrong. They knew the virtues. They knew which female was nursing a calf this season. The virtues are a family whose members carry the names of virtues: mercy, generosity, tolerance, honesty. A naming convention that began decades ago, when researchers first started building the database that now holds the histories of nearly 1,000 individual elephants along the Ewaso Nyiro. They knew when the coordinates came through from the tourists exactly which family that small animal on the wrong side of the river belonged to. Lewa Wildlife Conservancy joined the response, and rangers from Samburu National Reserve, and the three groups coordinated quickly, all of them arriving at the same understanding at the same time that the window for this was narrow and narrowing. A 2-month-old African elephant cannot regulate its own body temperature. It cannot find food. It cannot defend itself against anything that moves toward it with intent. And the Samburu ecosystem is not short of things that move with intent once the sun begins its descent and the light changes, and the animals that hunt at dusk begin to read the air for opportunity. The heat of the day was already building. Every hour mattered, and more than 3 had already gone. The vehicle moved fast on the track toward the river, the dust rising behind it in a long, pale plume that drifted south in the dry air, and the team inside was quiet. In the particular way of people who are running calculations they have run before, and who know that the outcome depends on too many variables to speak about yet. They found him where the tourists had last seen him, still on the same patch of ground, still in approximately the position where the separation had left him, as if he had taken the instruction his instincts gave him, and decided to follow it with complete fidelity, no matter what the hours brought. He was on his feet when they arrived, which mattered. He was thin through the flanks, which also mattered, but differently. His ears moved when he heard the vehicle swiveling toward the sound. Before the rest of him turned that early warning rotation that elephants of every age perform without deciding to the body processing information before the mind catches up. He looked at them. He backed away 2 steps, then stopped. The approach to a wild elephant calf in distress is nothing like approaching a domestic animal. There is no gesture, no sound, no posture that a 2-month-old elephant, whose world has been only his mother's body and the warmth of the herd, will read as safe from a human being, because nothing in his short life has offered him any frame for understanding that a human might intend something other than threat. The team moved slowly. They spread wide without crowding him. keeping the semicircle open toward the river so he did not feel cornered against the water behind him. They did not look directly at him, each person angling their gaze slightly away, toward the ground, toward the acacia line, anywhere but the calf's face. Because the direct gaze of a predator is a thing that animal bodies recognize before language gets involved. He backed away again. He called louder now, sharper, the sound escalating as the situation became more immediate, rather than less distress, sharpening into something closer to panic. He turned toward the riverbank, found the drop there, turned away from it. One of the team moved to his side, not his front, not looming above him, but alongside and slightly behind the approach that comes in at the edge of the visual field, rather than directly into it. The calf went still, the stillness of a body that has exhausted its alternatives, legs that had nowhere left to go. A blanket was already spread across the floor of the land cruiser, not arranged neatly, but laid flat and smoothed by hand across the metal ridges of the floor. A plain and practical act that someone had done before the vehicle stopped before anyone got out, in the automatic way of people who have prepared for this specific moment many times before. He was lifted carefully, two sets of hands coordinated without speaking, one at his shoulder and one at his hindquarters, and placed on the blanket in the vehicle's shade. He did not stop vocalizing. He called, and the sound of it filled the enclosed space of the vehicle, that high, insistent searching note, the call designed to reach a mother at close range, now bouncing off metal and glass. In a space that could not give him what he was asking for, one of the team sat beside him on the floor. Not touching him, not speaking to him, just present, a body nearby, the closest available approximation of the thing he was calling for, offered without pretense that it was the real thing. The vehicle moved south toward Buffalo Springs, and the dust came up behind it again, and the Ewaso Nyiro fell away to the north, brown and fast and indifferent, carrying its water toward the lowlands the way it always had and always would, regardless of what had happened at its banks that morning. At some point on the road, the calling slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The intervals between each call grew longer. The sound itself changed, losing some of its urgency, and taking on instead the flatter, more exhausted quality of a body that has been signaling for hours and is beginning to accept, without understanding, why that this form of waiting was the only one currently available to it. The person sitting on the floor of the vehicle did not move. The road ran south through the dry scrub of the reserve, and the heat pressed down on the roof of the vehicle and inside, and the smell of dust and warm metal and something animal. And frightened, a small elephant lay on a blanket and called for his mother at decreasing intervals. And outside the window, the landscape moved past umbrella thorn and red-barked commiphora and the occasional giraffe, standing motionless in the midday shade, watching the vehicle go by with the distant, unhurried attention that giraffes bring to everything. The team had a different problem to solve, and they needed to solve it before anything else could happen. After more than 3 hours of contact with humans, hands cloth the interior surfaces of a vehicle. The accumulated smell of human presence that clings to everything it touches. Even when the humans are careful, the calf no longer smelled entirely like himself. This matters more than it sounds. Elephants recognize each other through scent, the way humans recognize each other by face, except that the information carried in scent is far richer and more specific than anything a face can hold. The trunk of an African elephant contains more olfactory receptor genes than any other mammal that has been studied, and what the trunk reads when it investigates another elephant is not simply who this animal is, but where it has been, what it has touched, what has touched it, whether it has been somewhere strange, and whether what it carries now matches what the herd expects it to carry. The dung and secretions of an elephant family accumulate over years into a chemical signature that is specific to that group, built from the same grasses, the same water sources, the same physical proximity of bodies pressing against each other through seasons of heat and rain. It is the smell of belonging encoded in biology. The virtues would know their calf. They would also know that something in his scent had shifted, that he had been somewhere their signature did not reach, had been in contact with something outside the family's known world. And an elephant family presented with a known individual carrying unfamiliar chemical information does not always respond with welcome. The matriarch might read the strangeness before she read the familiarity. The herd might close instead of open. The solution the team had brought with them was not elegant, and it was not the kind of thing that photographs well or translates easily into the language of wildlife conservation as it is usually presented, but it was correct. Fresh dung from a member of the Virtues family collected earlier that day, while the team still had visual contact with the herd, had been kept carefully in the vehicle through the heat of the morning. One of the team opened the container. The smell hit the air immediately, dense fermented the concentrated biological record of an animal that had been eating the dry grasses and bitter shrubs of the Samburu Reserve for years. The smell of the herd's interior world brought into the sharp afternoon light. The calf lifted his head. His trunk swung toward the source of the smell, not precisely, not with the controlled extension of an adult reading the air, but in the loose, pivoting way of a trunk that is still learning what it is, still discovering that it has the capacity to search for things, drifting toward the scent the way a compass needle drifts toward north before it steadies. He did not move his feet, but his trunk had already decided. They worked it into his skin by hand across his back, down his flanks, along the sides of his face, and behind his ears into the folds of skin around his legs, where scent pools and lingers every surface that a Virtues elephant's trunk would reach. If it came to investigate this small animal, standing in open ground, he stood still for it, the stillness of an animal that has moved past the point where resistance requires more energy than remaining. The calf's trunk moved occasionally toward the hands that were working, not pulling away from them, but investigating them in the slow, tentative way that exhausted young animals sometimes turn toward whatever is present, because presence itself, even the wrong kind of presence, is better than none. The team worked without speaking more than they needed to. The afternoon light long and golden across the open ground, the acacia shadows stretching out precise and still. When they were finished, they stepped back and they waited, and the calf stood in the open ground with the smell of his family on his skin and the heat of the afternoon on his back. He turned his head slowly, testing the air. He made a sound low, not urgent, something between a call and a rumble, neither one thing nor the other. In the middle distance, the grass moved in a way that grass does not move when it is only wind. The Virtues came from the north. There were 7 of them visible at first, the large shapes moving through the late afternoon scrub in the way that elephant families move when they have found direction and are following it unhurried but purposeful, covering ground with the efficiency of animals that have been walking this landscape for their entire lives and know its distances in their bodies rather than their minds. The matriarch led. Behind her, the family fell into the loose formation of a group at ease, the adult females flanking the smaller shapes of the younger calves. One juvenile moving wide to the left, and then correcting back without any visible signal from the adults. The whole group held together by something below the threshold of what a human observer could see or hear, the infrasound frequencies that elephants use to coordinate across distances, the private language of a family that has been talking to itself across this landscape for years. The calf on the open ground had gone very still. He was facing them, his ears still slightly oversized for his head, in the way of very young elephants, the edges not yet filled out to the wide fans. They would eventually become, were held slightly away from his body, angled forward, every surface of them oriented toward the shapes coming through the scrub to the north. He had stopped making any sound. The Virtues stopped. Perhaps 50 meters of open ground separated the family from the small figure standing alone in the late light. The matriarch raised her trunk. She held it there, reading the air between them, the complex, layered information of distance and wind, and the particular composition of whatever was standing in that open space ahead of her, familiar and not familiar, at once recognizable and strange in a way that required more investigation before it required a response. She did not move forward. She did not move backward. She held the question in the air with her trunk and waited for the air to answer it. Behind her, one of the adult females had also raised her trunk. Then another. Then the young calves, too small to understand what was being processed, but old enough to read the attention of the adults around them and mirror. it began pressing close to the legs of their mothers. Not in fear, but in the instinctive tightening that happens when the herd's attention focuses on something, and the young ones do not yet know whether that something requires closing in or spreading out. The calf in the open ground made the sound again, the low between things sound that was neither call nor rumble, but contained something of both a sound for which there is no good name in English, but that carries in whatever register elephants read it, information that language cannot hold. From somewhere in this group behind the matriarch, a response moved through the air. Not loud. Not the kind of sound you could point to and say there that was the moment. It was the kind of sound that arrives in the chest before the ears register it. The infrasound frequencies that drop below human hearing, but that the body picks up anyway as a faint pressure, a resonance in the sternum, a feeling of something large and significant shifting in the air nearby. The matriarch took one step forward. The calf took one step toward her. They held that distance for a moment, one step closer on each side, the gap between them still wide, both of them reading the air and the ground and each other across it. Then she took another step, and he ran. Not smoothly. He stumbled once on the uneven ground, one front leg going slightly wrong, his whole body tilting before he caught himself and corrected and kept going. The inelegant, whole-body run of a very young animal who has not yet learned to trust all four legs at once. The kind of running that is more intention and urgency than it is form. The virtues moved toward him, not rushing, moving in the way they always moved toward something they had decided about with a combination of slowness and complete certainty that is, in the end, its own kind of statement. A declaration made not in speed, but in the absolute commitment of the pace. They met in the middle of the open ground. What happened then is visible in the record, but resists summary. The younger calves reached him first, pressing in with their trunks, finding his face, and the top of his head, and the space behind his ears. Quick, curious, overlapping investigations, each one a form of recognition being confirmed in real time. Something new that was also beneath the newness already theirs. The adults formed around them, not a tight defensive circle, but the loose breathing arrangement of a family that is gathering itself back together, each animal orienting toward the center where the smallest one stood. Trunks moved across his back. One large female, not the matriarch, one of the others, her approach slower and more deliberate, pressed the side of her face against his and held it there. She did not move for a moment. He did not move. She made a sound so low it was almost nothing, almost only a vibration in the ground, and he answered it with a sound equally low, equally close to the threshold of hearing, and whatever passed between them in that register is not something that can be translated. He pushed his head into the warm, solid mass of her body. She shifted her weight slightly to receive it a small adjustment. Unconscious, the body accommodating another body the way it does when the fit between them is already known. He pressed harder, she held. Around them, the rest of the family continued its greeting, the rumbling and the pressed foreheads and the entwining trunks that elephants perform after separation. The ceremony that has no equivalent in human behavior, but that researchers describe as among the most elaborate reunion rituals documented in any species. Every gesture of it, a form of reconfirmation, a checking and rechecking of the thing that had seemed for a few hours on the wrong side of a brown river to have been lost. The team watched from behind the vehicle. No one moved. The light was doing what the light does in the late afternoon in northern Kenya. The angle dropping the color, shifting from the hard white of midday through gold and deep gold, and finally into the particular burnt orange that precedes the dark. The light that makes every shape on the savannah cast a shadow 3 times its own length. The light under which everything looks inevitable looked it long enough. No one spoke. The virtues stayed on the open ground for some time longer than the reunion itself had taken. The family moving slowly within the clearing, rather than pushing north, no one among them yet signaling the direction that would come. The matriarch grazed at the edge of the group, pulling at the dry grass with her trunk and eating with the automatic concentration of an animal that eats whenever grazing is available. because the Samburu dry season teaches that lesson reliably. The smaller calves began to play bumping into each other, one of them leaning its whole weight against another, who did not quite expect it, the brief, rough tumbling that young elephants engage in when the alertness of the adults around them signals that the immediate situation no longer requires maximum attention. He was among them, not separate anymore, not the one being investigated and reconfirmed, just present, just another small shape in the loose cluster of small shapes that moved around the legs of the adults. Just a calf in a family that had somewhere to be before dark and would begin moving toward it when the matriarch decided the time had come. The matriarch finished grazing. She lifted her head and oriented north of the direction the family had come from, and something in the way she positioned her body, a slight forward lean, a settling of weight onto her front feet, communicated what the rest of the group needed to know. They began to move. Not quickly. The matriarch established direction, the others falling into formation around her, the calves finding their places between the legs of the adults. The whole family becoming again the single coordinated thing it is when it is together, and the ground is known, and the direction is clear. He moved with them. He was between two of the adult females, one on each side, their bodies forming a corridor of warmth and shade that he walked inside without appearing to think about it, the way a calf walks in the middle of the herd when everything is as it should be, when there is no decision to be made about where safety is, because safety is simply where you are. The family moved north through the last of the orange light. Behind them, the open ground of Buffalo Springs held only the marks they had made in it, the pressed circles of elephant feet, the torn grass where the matriarch had grazed, the slight depression in the center of the clearing, where a small animal had stood for a long time calling at decreasing intervals, waiting. The grass was already beginning to recover. The team watched until the shapes were gone, until the last gray curve of the rearmost animal had moved into the scrub and the bush had closed behind them, and the only evidence that the virtues had been there at all was the settling of disturbed dust in the still air and the broken stems of grass along the path they had taken north. For a moment there was nothing to watch. The Ewaso Nyiro was still running brown when the vehicle turned back toward Samburu, carrying the same brown water it had carried that morning from the same highlands toward the same distant lowlands it has always moved toward, without memory of what had happened at its banks or interest in what would happen next. It was not a river that kept records. It simply ran. He would not remember this day. He was 2 months old, and the kind of memory that builds a record of events, that stores sequences and causes unknown and the names of things, had not yet formed in him, and would not for some time still. What he had instead was something older and less precise, and in some ways more durable. The body's record written not in language, but in the way his breathing changed, when her warmth was close again, in the way his legs found their steadiness back between the legs of the adults, in the way his trunk moved toward the smell that was his family's smell, and found it there constant and surrounding the same as it had always been. The science of what happened today is not complicated. An elephant family recognizes its members through chemical signatures carried in dung and secretions. Signatures so specific that even hours of human contact, hands and cloth, and the interior of a vehicle can be addressed, can be answered, can be given back to the family it belongs to, with a solution that is older than the conservation organizations that now apply it, older than the Ewaso Nyiro's recorded history, older than almost everything except the elephants themselves, and the noses they used to read the world. The knowledge that made the difference today did not come from a laboratory. It came from decades of patient attention to what elephants actually do, how they greet, how they investigate what they need in order to recognize what is theirs and receive it back. That attention is its own kind of argument, made quietly over years in the dry scrub north of the equator, by people who decided that understanding these animals was worth the long, slow, unglamorous work of learning to see them properly. 3 hours, a handful of dung. And what no technology creates a herd that knew what was theirs and came to collect it. There was a second calf recovered from the Ewaso Nyiro that same day. His family could not be found despite the search. He is being cared for now by people who know this work. And he is doing well. And what lies ahead for him is not the story that ended in that clearing in the last orange light of the afternoon. It is a different story, longer and less immediate one, that will take more time and follow a different path before it arrives at whatever it is building toward. But it is moving. Like the river, it moves in only one direction.